The land promise in Genesis 15 is one of the most debated passages in Abrahamic theology. In that chapter, God tells Abram that his seed will be given land stretching from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. For many readers, this verse has become the foundation for major religious and political claims about the land. Many Messianic Jews and Christian Zionists interpret this promise as a divine grant of Eretz Yisrael, or Greater Israel, to the Israelites or the Jewish people. In this view, the promise belongs specifically to the descendants of Jacob, and continues to support Jewish claims over a wide territory in the modern Middle East. However, another interpretation argues that Genesis 15 should not be read only through the later history of Jacob's descendants. The passage speaks of Abraham's seed, but it does not yet name Isaac, Jacob, or the Israelite nation. At this point in the biblical story, the promise is still attached directly to Abraham and his wider line of descent. This detail is important because the next major birth narrative after Genesis 15 is the birth of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son. Ishmael appears before Isaac in the biblical sequence, and he is traditionally understood as the ancestor of many Arab peoples. From this perspective, the timing of the story suggests that Ishmael, as Abraham's firstborn son, stands within the Abrahamic covenantal legacy before the later Sinai covenant is given to Jacob's descendants. From this perspective, the seed of Abraham in Genesis 15 can be understood as referring to Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, who remained under the Abrahamic covenant. By contrast, Isaac's descendants through Jacob entered a later and more specific covenant, the Sinai covenant, given through Moses and conditioned upon faithfulness to God's law. This distinction between the Abrahamic covenant and the Sinai covenant is central to the argument. The Abrahamic covenant is seen as older, broader, and connected to Abraham's direct promise. The Sinai covenant, however, came later through Moses and was given specifically to the children of Israel after the Exodus. Under the Sinai covenant, Israel's blessings in the land were repeatedly linked to obedience, faithfulness, and keeping God's commandments. Leviticus 26, for example, presents security in the land as conditional. If the Israelites obey God, they receive blessing. If they rebel, they face punishment, exile, and loss. From a Christian and Islamic perspective, this raises a serious theological question. If the religious authorities among the Israelites rejected the Messiah when he came, can the land still be claimed unconditionally under the same covenantal terms? This interpretation argues that covenant privilege cannot be separated from covenant responsibility. The argument also points out that later biblical descriptions of Israel's land, such as those found in Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Ezekiel, often describe a smaller territory than the vast region mentioned in Genesis 15. This suggests that the wide promise from Egypt to the Euphrates may belong to a broader Abrahamic horizon rather than only to the later national borders of Israel. Supporters of this reading argue that the spread of Ishmael's descendants and the later expansion of Islam across a vast region, including lands between Egypt and the Euphrates and even beyond, may be understood as a historical fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham through Ishmael. In this view, the promise was not left unfulfilled, nor does it need to be revived through a modern political project of Greater Israel. Under this interpretation, the broad land promise of Genesis 15 was fulfilled through Abraham's firstborn line, especially through the descendants of Ishmael and the spread of Islam. The later covenant with Israel at Sinai had its own separate land framework, but it was narrower, more specific, and conditional upon obedience to God's law. This reading therefore challenges the claim that Genesis 15 automatically supports modern territorial expansion in the name of Greater Israel. It argues that such a claim may confuse two different covenants, the Abrahamic covenant associated with Ishmael and the Sinai covenant associated with Jacob's descendants. The deeper issue is not only geography, but covenant theology. If Ishmael is acknowledged as Abraham's firstborn and as standing within Abraham's covenantal legacy, then the promise made to Abraham's seed can be interpreted as applying to Ishmael. At the same time, the descendants of Israel also had their own historical inheritance in the land of Canaan, before the coming of Islam, beginning with Joshua and continuing through the kingdoms of David and Solomon. In this view, the Israelites did receive and rule the land within their own biblical history. However, that inheritance belonged to the later Sinai covenant, which was given through Moses and tied to obedience, justice, and faithfulness to God's law. Therefore, it should not be confused with the broader Abrahamic covenant, which this interpretation connects especially with Ishmael as Abraham's firstborn, Abraham's wider covenantal legacy, and the later spread of Islam among Ishmael's descendants. The conclusion of this interpretation is that the struggle for Greater Israel today is theologically unnecessary and may even contradict the will of God. The land of Canaan had already been inherited by the Israelites in the pre-Islamic period through Joshua and later ruled under King David and King Solomon, while the wider Abrahamic promise may be understood as fulfilled through Abraham's broader family, especially through Ishmael and the spread of Islam. Therefore, the proper response is not conquest or endless territorial expansion, but humility, justice, and peace among the peoples who trace their story back to Abraham.